great pleasure to be here with you all. I feel very at home. College students have gotten so much older, and since I feel a little bit nervous when I looked at I sat down on my seat, and I'm not sure I've ever been sort of rated in real time before. I feel like the guy at the end of the customer service call says, "Now give me all fives," when the supervisor checks in. But it really is. I've been looking forward to getting to be here because this is such an important place, and because it's such an important moment. I actually am on my way to Asia for 6 weeks of fighting coal mines and things, but you want me a little louder there? But I stopped off because, because we're up again it now in a way that we haven't been before, and the time is now, if it's ever going to be, for taking action. I think I'm actually a little more reflective than I've been in the past, because I spent the winter, I was actually home for much of the winter, which was great, and writing a new book that's kind of I see people are having trouble hearing, but I don't see how I'm going to get this any. Okay, you can, let me see if this is even closer. Is that any better? That was really good. We'll try. How's that? Absolutely. This book in some ways follows on marks the 30th anniversary of that book, The End of Nature, which was the first book about climate change. And so it got me thinking a good deal about the passage of time. I think someone you have to type in your secret code here to allow us to look at pictures. I founded 350.org entirely with young people because they all knew how to use all the technology that I was unable to. I've spent many years as the old guy asking people to program my phone for me, and my wife dug up a picture of me when I was 27 and writing The End of Nature, looking appropriately concerned about things there. I don't know how well you can see that. Probably just as well you can't, because it demonstrates pretty powerfully what happens to you if you spend 30 years worrying about climate change all the time.
Can they turn the lights down?
I hope they could. Maybe they could. That would save us just a tiny bit of energy too along the way. Maybe is there a light switch back there someplace, Casey? They're working on it. Good. It's never that simple. You can see that picture though, and you all have it in your mind's eye, those of you of a certain age, because those were the pictures that came back from the Apollo mission in the 1960s. Our first glimpse of the world from, the world as it is, this blue-white marble floating off in this black void of space. And we all told ourselves when we saw those pictures for the first time how remarkable they were. You could see that there were no political boundaries on Earth, and how fragile things were, and how we were all going to take this as incentive to do the right thing and protect the planet and so on and so forth. And then we didn't. The Earth has changed more in the 50 years since those pictures were taken than it changed in the 10,000 years before they were taken. It's changed at about the same pace and about as dramatically as picture of me has changed over that time, okay? That's the Arctic. The yellow line is where summer sea ice was 40 years ago, and it's where it was 8,000 years ago. It's where it spent most of the Holocene. In the last 30 years, half of the extent of that ice has vanished, and way more than half the ice is gone because what's left is now thin and crumbling and decayed. There are changes on that scale happening every place, everywhere around the world now. When I was writing about this 30 years ago, still theoretical and abstract, but not anymore. The scale of the changes is so great that we see them just cascading at us now. Think about our own country, the 2% of the planet that's covered by the United States, and think about the last 6 months. Hurricane Harvey comes to Texas and drops more rain than any storm in the history of the United States. The kind of rainfall only possible in a world where you've raised the temperature of the air and hence the amount of water it can hold. It dropped 4.5 feet of rain on parts of Texas. Okay? 2 weeks later, Hurricane Irma delivers the longest sustained winds above 180 miles an hour we've ever measured on this planet. Many, many straight cycles of catastrophic wind. 2 weeks after that, Hurricane Maria plows into our countrymen in Puerto Rico and absolutely devastates the place. We got the first real tally 2 days ago of the economic damage from Hurricane Maria. So far, and there's an immense amount of work left to be done, it's done $90 billion worth of damage on Puerto Rico. The GDP of Puerto Rico last year was $101 billion. So in essence, the entire economy it just flattened like that. That picture's from 2 days ago. It's the illustration on an important article in Nature about what's happening with the great ocean currents that keep the world in the kind of stable temperature pattern that makes our lives possible. That's the biggest river on Earth. It's the volume of about 100 times the volume of the Amazon, okay? But it's dropped by about 15% in my lifetime because of climate change. That is, the flow equivalent to 15 Amazon rivers has disappeared from that band, just like that, okay? We can see these changes at the very biggest levels, and we can see them at the very smallest levels. When I was writing that book, once I'd finished writing The End of Nature and before it was published, I took a reporting trip to the Maldive Islands in the Indian Ocean to look at what was going on there. And at the time, it had the most beautiful reefs, some of them in the entire world, surrounding all the small islands that make up that archipelago where people have lived for 5,000 years and fish much longer. It looked like that, and like that, and like that, and now it looks like that, okay? Almost all the coral around the Maldives wiped out, killed in a couple of big bleaching events. These are now commonplace around the world every year. The biggest ones we've ever measured have happened in the last 2 years. I was in the Pacific with our crew at 350 in the Pacific, just happened to be there 2 springs ago when a huge wave of warm water slowly sloshed across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and in the course of a couple of weeks wiped out 70, 80, 90, 100% of the coral around island after island after island. I remember talking to marine biologists. I remember talking to a woman coming up from dive, marine biologist, and she said, I had to come up, my mask was filled with tears. The study site that I've been working on for 40 years is now just a boneyard, and 2 weeks ago it was alive and vibrant. The Great Barrier Reef is the biggest living structure on the planet, but it's half as alive as it was 18 months ago. This has obvious impacts on the rest of creation, but it also has huge impacts on many of the poorest and most vulnerable people on the planet. There's 500 million people who depend on coral reefs for most of their protein. These are the structures that, when they're alive, block the wave action that would otherwise inundate these low-lying tropical islands. And that's the first reminder of the main thing that I want to talk about today, which is the just basic unfairness in a way that we have never seen before of what's happening with climate change. There's an almost perfect inverse relationship between how much of the problem you caused and how quickly you feel the damage, okay? And that has got to be at the heart of our understanding of it if we're going to respond in the ways that we need to respond. I want to make a confession as I do this, which is that it took me a long time to figure out what I was doing. I wrote The End of Nature when I was 27, and I didn't know much about the world at all. My theory of change was people will read my book, and then they will change. And that's actually not precisely how it works, as it turns out. A lot of people did read the book. It was 24 languages and bestseller and things, but the problem was, I kept writing more books. Lots of other people started writing books. There were lots of symposiums and special editions of journals and on and on and on, lots of speeches. We thought we were having an argument, and that once we'd won the argument, that our leaders would then do the right thing and start taking action against what was clearly the biggest problem on the planet. And it took me too long to figure out we weren't having an argument, that we had won the argument early on. By the early 1990s, mid-1990s, the world scientists were in complete and useful consensus about precisely what was happening, okay? But it wasn't changing the thing. The amount of carbon flowing into the atmosphere not only kept going up, it accelerated its climb, okay? We weren't having an argument, we were having a fight. And the fight, as fights always are, was about money and about power. And the people on the other side, the fossil fuel industry, had enough money and hence enough power to be winning that fight despite the fact that they had conclusively lost the argument. We understand now a little bit more about precisely how that argument went, and I'll talk about that when I get there, about the kind of bad faith that we were operating with, but operating against. But I will say the event that really brought it home to me was just another reporting trip that I took, this one to Bangladesh and the Asian subcontinent. Very beautiful place, very wet, fertile, the delta of the great sacred river of that part of the world, the Brahmaputra, as it flows down from the Himalayas into the Bay of Bengal. And I went there because long-term or even medium-term, Bangladesh faces immense problems from climate change. The Bay of Bengal is rising, the glaciers are dwindling, bad news. But while I was there, it just so happened that they were facing, in addition, a tremendously acute problem. The first big outbreak of a disease called dengue fever that the World Health Organization says is the emergent disease of our century around the planet, because the mosquito that transmits it, Aedes aegypti, very much likes the warm, wet world that we are building on its behalf, okay? So there I was in Bangladesh, and they were having their first outbreak of this, and it was very scary. I was scared, everybody was scared. They were putting pictures on the front page of the paper to help people identify what the mosquito looked like and to help identify if they had the symptoms of it, okay? Which are unpleasant to look at, and I apologize for putting that up. I was spending a lot of time in the slums, so I eventually got bit by the wrong mosquito myself, and I was as sick as I've ever been, but obviously didn't die because I was strong and well-fed going into this, okay? Lots and lots of people were dying. I remember going to the clinic in Dhaka. There's no treatment really for dengue because only poor people have ever gotten it, so why would you bother to really work on a treatment? But there's a room much bigger than this, just with cots lined up, and people sort of lying on them, shivering. One of those tropical fevers that alternates chills and sweat. My main thought, beyond, boy, do I feel wretched, was, boy, is this unfair. There's 180 million people in Bangladesh, but when the UN measures how much carbon each country in the world emits, you basically can't even get a useful number for those 180 million people. It's a rounding error in the calculations, okay? Their contributions are so small. And yet, far more than any of us, they're feeling the effects of this in absolute real time, in absolute dire ways. Not just dengue, but people having to relocate constantly as the Bay of Bengal rises and pushes salt water inland, and just on and on and on. And to come back home and realize, sort of be reminded that the 4% of us who live here have contributed more carbon to the Earth's atmosphere by far than any other nation on Earth over history. It was like time to do more than simply write another book. It wasn't going to move the needle. We know now precisely why that fight was so hard, Investigative reporters in the last 2 or 3 years have uncovered remarkable evidence about how the fossil fuel industry, Exxon being the prime example, knew everything there was to know about climate change 30 years ago. And their great scientists explained to them exactly what was going to go on, and they believed it. They started building their drilling rigs to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was on the way. But they didn't tell anybody else. Instead, they and their compatriots spent billions of dollars building this architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that really kind of morphed into a way the kind of fake news industry that's now sort of much larger, but that's in many ways where it got its legs. Good news, by the way, about an hour ago, the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts ruled that the Attorney General of the state of Massachusetts indeed has ruled against Exxon, and the state attorney general has the right to demand all their early documents on climate change and what they knew as part of a large lawsuit that she's launched against them. So that was good news. But we have wasted 25 years on a completely phony debate about whether or not global warming was real, a debate that both sides knew the answer to when the debate began. It's just one of them was willing to lie about it, okay? So the more that I sort of thought about all that, the more I understood that we were going to need to try and build power of our own. And it obviously wasn't going to come from money, so the only other alternative was, well, the kind of currency of movements, of passion and spirit and creativity that on occasion has been able in our history to stand up to what would otherwise be overwhelming power. Having said that, I mean, it sounds good, but I had no more idea how to build a movement than, anybody else. I still don't really, but I'm a writer. I live off in the woods in the second smallest state in the Union, and I'm not even, you can tell by listening to me, I'm not even like a speaker, I'm a writer. I mean, it's nice to be here with you, but given my druthers, I'd really rather be home in my room typing. That's what I like to do. But we decided we'd have to do something, and the first thing we decided to do was we take a march across Vermont. Actually, it's not completely true. The first thing we decided, I said, we should go up to Burlington, which is our main city. Not much, is 50,000 people, so not that much of a city, but it's what we've got. We go up there and we'll sit in on the steps of the federal building and we'll get arrested, and there'll be a story in the paper, and that'll be good. And everybody's, my friends were, yeah, it's a good idea, let's do that. But happily, one of them called up to the police in Burlington. What would happen if we carry out this intrepid plan? Police said, nothing will happen. Stay there as long as you want. So we were like, okay, we're not going to do that. And instead, we marched for 5 days up the western side. We left from Robert Frost's old summer writing cabin because he's our kind of patron saint. And we walked for 5 days. I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher, so I'd called the Methodist churches along the route to have potluck suppers along the way. Potluck suppers, kind of the Methodist sacrament, And we made our way north, and we got to the edge of Burlington. And by that time, there were 1,000 people walking. Now, you all live in a urbane, cosmopolitan place, so for you, 1,000 people is nothing. But in Vermont, with the exception of University of Vermont hockey games, 1,000 people is as many people as you ever get. We got to the city line in Burlington, and there to greet us was our then congressman, then running for senator, Mr. Sanders. And he was super excited because he's like a movement guy. And he was like, wow, this is great. This is the best thing I've ever seen. This is the best thing since the Vietnam War. This is unbelievable. This is so great. What's this about again? He said, as it turns out, he's become the greatest champion of everything we're trying to do in DC, the one person on whom we utterly depend. But what was amazing was to open the Burlington paper the next day and read a story that said these 1,000 people represented the largest demonstration that had yet taken place about climate change in the US. This was 2006, almost 20 years into the period when we knew about it. And when I read that, I thought, no wonder we lose, you know? We've got the superstructure of a movement. We've got scientists and policy, Al Gore, all this. We just don't, the part we forgot was the movement part. There's nothing there to give it any heft to scare or encourage or anything else, any politician. And so we set to work trying to remedy that, to create a movement where there hadn't been one before. And it was a pretty ludicrous proposition, really, to try and do it, especially since the we in this case was myself and 7 college students, 6 of whom you see there at Middlebury. And you know, we wanted to organize globally, so we took the name 350.org. You know that it represents in parts per million how much carbon the scientists say is safe to have in the atmosphere. But we chose it in part because of that, but in part because we wanted to organize globally, and we figured that Arabic numerals were easier than words, you know, English words to go around the world. But we didn't, I mean, there were 7 students, there are 7 continents, each one took one, you know. The guy that took the Antarctic also had to take the internet, all right? And off we set to do our work and to find people like ourselves around the world. And it turned out that there were people all over the world who were eager to help. Now, there's not everywhere someone called an environmentalist, but there's everywhere someone interested in women's issues, in war and peace, in hunger, in public health, in all the things you're not going to have on a degraded planet. And they understood immediately that they wanted to join in. We'd asked everybody to do something on the same day in the October of, I guess, 2009 now, so long ago. As our kind of coming out party, try and take this information and start plugging it into the information bloodstream of the planet, as it were. We didn't know if it would work. We got the first sense it would work maybe 2 days early because we were sitting around our office, around our one table, and the phone rang, and it was our leader in Ethiopia, who, like all of us, was a volunteer, like most of us was a she, like an awful lot of us was 17 years old, and she was saying, she and her sister, who lived in Addis Ababa, had been organized and were sort of leading the organization, and she was in tears. She said, the government's taken away our permit for Saturday for our demonstration, so we're going to do it today before they can stop us. She was in tears, though, not because, I mean, that was brave, and she could have gotten in a lot of trouble. Ethiopia, not a particularly nice government all the time. But she was crying because she said, we want to do it the same day as everybody else. We want to be part of this whole big thing all over the world. We're really sorry, we really apologize, and we have 15,000 young people out in the street. I don't know if there's a picture of, I don't think there is a picture of this here or not. We have 15,000 young people out in the street in Addis Ababa right now chanting 350, and they'd actually managed to persuade the school system of Ethiopia to rewrite its textbooks to make climate change a sort of central focus, which it should be in a country that's changing that fast. At any rate, that sort of unlocked 72 hours of demonstrations from every corner of the planet. There were 5,200 rallies in 181 countries, what CNN called the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history. And, you know, they were beginning in, you know, Australia, because that's where the date line falls, but just absolutely everywhere. And it was really, really powerful moment. and the beginning of a series of powerful moments, most of which now owe nothing or very little to 350.org, because this movement, like all movements need to do, has just completely taken on a life of its own. And all over the world, people have figured out how to do things. This is just one image from Standing Rock 2 years ago that's always stuck in my mind, just a kind of demonstration of the kind of bravery that people are showing all over the place. The leadership that's come from indigenous communities around the continent and around the world is one of the most encouraging parts of this work over the last 10 years. They're now fully in front of an awful lot of this work. Just last week in Canada, they managed to win a tremendous victory, stopping at least temporarily the next great tar sands pipeline that the Trudeau government wants to run west through British Columbia. But First Nations leaders are absolutely, it's wonderful not only for what it, because of their ability to mobilize and organize, but because what it reflects about the oldest wisdom traditions on our planet, native and indigenous wisdom traditions, lining up so perfectly with the absolute newest wisdom traditions. I mean, the message that comes from the Sweat Lodge and the message that comes from the satellite and the supercomputer are now pretty much perfectly aligned, and that's a powerful place, I think. At least I hope that it's going to be going forward. As I said, I'm on my way to Australia, and we're fighting would be the largest coal mine on planet Earth, and it's Aboriginal people who are in the forefront of that fight, and I think we're going to win. I'm not certain. It's a huge fight, but I'm hopeful because the people are doing such an amazing job. We can organize now huge gatherings when we need to. 400,000 people in the streets of New York a couple of years ago. And we can organize, all kinds of creative things. There's the, we did a day they called the largest art project in history, and about 20 places around the world had these vast agglomerations of people that we needed satellites to take pictures of. This was my favorite. It's one of those dried out arroyos in the desert, now sort of arid southwest. That's one right in Santa Fe. And when the satellite came over, 2,000 or 3,000 people put blue blankets up overhead for a second just to bring the river back to life. And it was very beautiful and a reminder of the stakes. I wish that we had 50, 75 years, because if we did, all we'd need to do, I think, is this kind of ongoing education, and then we'd get the kind of generational change that's enough to move us forward and so on. Our problem, of course, is we don't have 50 or 75 years. We had to start 25 or 30 years ago, and we did not. And so now we are at the point where, along with education, I fear we need a certain amount of that confrontation that we're seeing. And so it means things like people going to jail. There's the greatest climate scientist in the world, Jim Hansen, about to get loaded into a paddy wagon at the beginning of the fight against the Keystone Pipeline in 2011. I'm so grateful to all of you, many of you I know, who helped in that fight. And it became the sort of prototypical fight for how to stand up to fossil fuel infrastructure around the world. Last year, the head of the American Petroleum Institute gave a speech to his peers and said to all his other oil company guys, we somehow have to find a way to stop the Keystoneization of all our projects. And when I heard that, I confess my dark heart was quite happy, and it was good. It shouldn't take the most eminent climate scientist in the world going to jail to make this happen. It should take the most eminent climate scientist in the world saying, you know what, your climate's changing in a big way and it's going to do you all in and you best do something about it. That should actually be enough, but that turns out our world is perhaps a little less rational than we would like to think. And this illustrates that, it's a demonstration of just where we are right now, and it's not in a good place. We had hoped over the last 3 years that carbon emissions had kind of plateaued, those 3 black dots up there at the top. I mean, even that's not a great help because we need it to come down to 0 and we needed to do it very, very fast. But we thought at least perhaps it had plateaued. We just got the numbers for last year. That's the red dot at the top. Carbon is ticking back up into the atmosphere. Our politics are obviously coming unglued in all kinds of places, predominantly this place. And you can tell by looking at the atmosphere. So we need much more organizing. I'll talk just very briefly about the sort of three-pronged thing that we're doing at 350 all over the world, the same kind of three messages over and over and over again. The first one is this transition to 100% renewable energy, which is now doable. 10 years ago, this was kind of a hard thing to talk about, you know, because it was still expensive, still hard. How are we going to do it? The engineers completely did their job. The price of a solar panel has just plummeted. I mean, when I was in college, it was $76 a watt, and now it's 30 cents a watt. Okay? That changes everything. We have no doubt that we could do this. In fact, we're beginning to do it. You can see the kind of installation of solar panels. It's just not going anywhere near fast enough to catch up with the physics of climate change. We would need to make this our priority. We need to treat it the way that, say, in the heartland of this country, the industrial heartland of America, at the outbreak of World War II, we made it our focus to learn how, in the course of a year, to make tanks and planes and all the other things that became kind of the arsenal of the fight against fascism. Well, we'd need to be doing it on the same scale with solar panels and wind turbines and so on and so forth. And of course, we're not. At the moment, we're going backward. Our president put a stiff tariff on solar panels a few months ago as a present to the one of many to the fossil fuel industry. And among other things, that's brought to a halt the growth of solar power in this country. After 5 or 6 years of steadily accelerating, it's now leveled straight off. When we think about solar power, we think about sort of affluent suburbs and things. And we should, because affluent white people produce an ungodly amount of the carbon on the planet, and so we very much need them to stop doing it, okay? And so it's good that we're doing it in these places. But it's not the only places we're doing it. I was spent last spring, this time last year, I was in Africa for quite a while doing a long piece for the New Yorker about the very rapid spread of renewable energy now in the most remote parts of Africa. There's still more than 1 billion people on the planet who don't have electricity, i.e. for whom coal and gas and oil have done essentially nothing, might as well not ever have been discovered. There are more people without access to electricity now than there were the day that Thomas Edison invented the electric light bulb, which tells you something both about demography and inequality at the same time, okay? But the good news is that it's now clear how they're going to get electricity. It's not going to be by building more. They'll never get coal-fired power plants in the grid and all of that in numbers enough to make any difference. Instead, it's going to be through distributed, dispersed, decentralized application of renewable energy, beginning with solar panels on the top of people's huts. And man, is it moving, and a reminder of what a world of luxury we live in to sort of be there and see that transition happening. I spent one afternoon sitting with several chiefs of local villages who had installed there in those villages. A solar microgrid had been installed the week before. 40 or 50 solar panels and the kind of rudimentary wiring that went to each house and things. And these guys kept handing me, this is in Ghana, and they kept handing me bottles of cold water to drink, which I was grateful for because it was on the equator and it was hot. And I'm from Vermont and heat is not my thing and whatever, I was grateful. But it took me like 15 minutes in my clueless Western way to figure out why they were so proud to be handing me bottles of cold water. There'd never been anything cold in that village until the week before. Like basically the concept of cold might as well not have existed because there was no way to have a refrigerator or anything else. Now there was, and it was a beautiful reminder. I mean, the fact that you can now basically point a piece of glass at the sun, and out the back flows light and cold and communications, and that's a miracle on a kind of Hogwarts scale, you know? And we're not taking advantage of it, not taking full advantage of it. We will eventually, you know. 75 years from now, the planet will run on sun and wind, because free is a hard business proposition to beat, you know. But at the rate we're going now, the world that we power with sun and wind in 75 years will be a broken planet. We have to do it very fast. We have to make that transition much faster than that 75 years to have some hope of warding off much more damage from climate change. So job 2 is about keeping it in the ground. About making sure that even as we build this renewable stuff, we keep the fossil fuel industry from digging up, drilling, mining the stuff they want to get at, because the scientists have made absolutely clear that we can burn at best about 20% of the reserves that the fossil fuel industry has identified and told its shareholders and banks and things that it wants to burn, if we have any hope even of meeting the kind of 2-degree target that we've set. We can win some of these battles, you know. In fact, many of them. I'm actually surprised by how often we do win. The Keystone Pipeline's a a good example. When we set out to fight it in 2011, the National Journal, the kind of trade paper for Washington, polled its 300 energy insiders, and 93% of them said TransCanada would have its permit by the end of 2011. But then more people came to engage in civil disobedience, very civil disobedience, it must be said, than about anything in decades in this country, and that picture began to change. And Keystone was defeated until Donald Trump, on his second day in office, re-permitted it. But Donald Trump's convinced that it's been built. He goes around the world explaining to people that this pipeline, it's nowhere near being built, and I don't think it's gonna be. There are great activists, especially across the Midwest. Our friends at Bold, Nebraska have done an astonishing job. Among other things, they've built solar arrays in dozens of places in the path of that pipeline. They're going to have to rip up huge amounts of clean energy to build this thing if they ever want to. And I don't, but we'll see. We may need to call on you to head up to Nebraska or the Dakotas sometime in the next couple of years. But this fight continues, and as I say, many others. We don't win them all, but we win some of them. And every time we fight, we slow them down. My friend Naomi Klein said at one point, we don't have the political power to get a carbon tax through Congress, but we can impose a de facto carbon tax with our bodies. We can slow these things down. And the way that big projects work, every time you slow something down for a year, the price of it just goes up and up and up and up. The carrying costs for doing this kind of work are enormous. And while that's happening, the price of a solar panel keeps going down and down and down, and the spreadsheet gets worse and worse and worse. So there's some hope, especially if we do the third part of this job, the part that Tyler's been working on for so long, and many of the rest of you, the effort to cut off the supply of money to this industry. Not all of us live next to a coal mine. Not all of us have a pipeline that's sort of going to go through our backyard. Every one of us is connected to pots of money that help fund this work, and we can get in the way there, whether it's endowments of universities or church pension funds or state and local pension funds or on and on and on. And as Tyler pointed out, this has sort of worked beyond our wildest imaginings. Following the lead that Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu had given us, saying this was the tactic that worked to help defeat apartheid. And it was Tutu who said, try it again, because climate change is the moral crisis, the human rights crisis of our time. So we did. It's now turned into something much larger than that ever was. We have endowments and portfolios of about $6 trillion that have divested. Last week, the University of California system, biggest university system on earth, said it would no longer invest in coal and oil and gas. In November, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is the biggest pool of money on planet Earth, said it would it would divest from fossil fuel. That was particularly significant because Norway made all its money in oil up in the North Sea. And it's like, the announcement was sort of the equivalent of saying, look, we won a ton of money in this casino, and now we're cashing in our chips because we can tell it's not the right casino to be in anymore. We're going to go off, find some other casino to play in that does something different. Maybe the biggest win of all came in January. I was sitting around my house one Sunday evening, January, just reading, and the phone rang, and it was the mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, and he said, well, we're going to announce on Wednesday that we're divesting our $200 billion pension funds from, will you come down for the announcement? Yes, I will. And I went down, and I was glad I did, because I spoke for like a minute, and what I said was just, Mr. Mayor, thank you. You should be very proud of this forward-looking step you're taking. It's a very big deal because there's no pot of money closer to the kind of money central in the world. I mean, this is the smartest money on the planet, the closest to Wall Street you can get. It's a very big deal. It's such a big deal that they should light up the Empire State Building green tonight just to celebrate. He was like, thank you. So I got back in my car and drove to Vermont and stopped for dinner, plugged in my car to charge it up, while I ate and stuff, and turned on my phone, and someone sent me a picture of the Empire State Building. And I was like, for the first time in my life, I was like, whoa, now I understand why someone would want to be like mayor. That's really cool. All the rest of it just seems like going to a bunch of meetings and, dealing, but like you can just tell them to light up the Empire State Building. That's great, okay? This is such important work, and I hope you all will keep pressing here as much as you can. This is one of these great fights that even when you lose it, you win it, because just keeping it in front of people all the time, not letting them forget what's going on. And it's especially powerful, I gotta say, at universities because of the fact that Exxon and all the other ones, they've lied for 25 years about what they knew about fossil fuel. If they were students at the University of Illinois, they would be kicked out for cheating. I mean, intellectual dishonesty should be the sin that academia, above all else, abhors, and so there's no excuse for it. You also lose a ton of money when you invest in fossil fuel because it's the worst performing part of the economy and has been for many years now. I want to leave you with just a few images that really go to some of these questions that I'm so glad that you all are tackling about environmental justice. We can think about it in lots of ways, and one of them is domestically here in our country. Takes not the slightest bit of cleverness to figure out who gets screwed most of the time when we do environmentally bad things. It's always the poorest and most vulnerable people who pay the biggest price. And in many parts of the country, that means people of color. So you go to, Michigan, and what do you know? It's Flint that is the place that gets chosen to have poison water. And, you want to find out where, coal ash spills have wiped out whole communities. It's always in the poorest communities of color, and I'm very cognizant you guys have a big coal ash fight going on around here, and please keep it up. That's an important fight to be having. The idea that you should just be able to kind of pretend that the residue of the last 50 years of generating cheap power doesn't exist is such a crazy idea. So there's that whole dimension to it that's very, very important, and that we have to concentrate on all the time in our country, and that we're doing exactly the opposite of. One of the things that the EPA under Scott Pruitt managed to do was, within weeks, eliminate its Office of Environmental Justice. Trump wanted to take every last bit of funding out of that office, okay? I suppose in order to buy more bulletproof desks and soundproof booths and all the other things that the administrator of the EPA seems to require in order to do his job. But the other dimension that really climate change above all throws into stark relief is this kind of global dimension around racism and justice and everything else. I was talking about it with Bangladesh, but I could talk about it with 100 places around the world. The people who pay the biggest price right away are the people who have done nothing to cause the trouble that we're in. And they're happily, and to my mind, somewhat amazingly, also the people who are willing to work hard to try and keep it from happening. If I lived in Bangladesh or if I lived in the Maldives, I mean, I'm not sure I would actually be that keen to work with a lot of, white North Americans on, I think I might just say, you've caused enough trouble, go back home. But in fact, with great generosity of spirit and great sense of fellow purpose, everybody has around the world begun to figure out how to cooperate in really powerful ways. I showed you that picture of 400,000 people marching in New York. The same weekend in the Pacific, all our colleagues there, people I'm going off to see in the next couple of weeks, on islands like Tuvalu and the Marshalls and Micronesia and the Solomons, places that probably aren't going to be there by the end of the century because they're just too low to the water. But these people are not giving up. Their slogan is, we're not drowning, we're fighting. And their fight that summer, on each of these islands, they took down a tree and built a traditional war canoe, one per island, and then took them off to Newcastle in Australia, not that far away, which is the biggest coal port on the planet. More carbon moves through it than any other place on Earth, okay? And there for a day, they used those canoes to blockade the giant ore ships in the harbor, and it was a beautiful demonstration of solidarity. It's one of the reasons I think we're going to win this coal mine fight, because it really helped Australians see just how absurd it was to endanger everyone around them in order to keep mining coal a little longer. But it also helped the world kind of see, I'm a writer, so the world works, we understand the world through stories, and there's a sort of series of tropes, repeating kind of images that are very important. And one of them, and the one that's operative in this fight, the one that we really need to internalize, is shown in that picture. This is a fight of the very few and very big against the many and small, okay? It's one of the kind of classic, I mean, that's the Death Star, and those are the rebels, down there doing what they can. And it's an image that once I sort of started seeing it, repeats all over the place. That's the next year in the Pacific Northwest. That big 40-story drilling rig belongs to Shell Oil, and they announced that they wanted to go drill in the Arctic, okay? Which, if you think about it, is almost literally, it is literally insane. I mean, climate scientists had said, if you keep burning all this coal and gas and oil, you're going to melt the Arctic. Okay, and then the Arctic melted. And you would think that someone like Shell looking at that might say, maybe we should go into the solar panel business instead because this whole melting everything thing is not working out particularly well. But that's not what they said. They said, it's melted up there now, it'll be easier to drill for more oil. Okay, sort of wash, rinse, repeat. You know, I mean, it's just the craziest. It's enough to make you wonder whether the big brain was a useful adaptation or not, you know. But happily, there were plenty of people with perfectly good brains and large hearts who were willing to get in the way. And in Portland and Seattle, thousands of people in small craft appeared. We called them kayaktivists. And they did so much brand damage to Shell over the course of that summer that Shell just gave up because they understood what those pictures looked like all over the world. They'd spent $9 billion preparing to drill in the Arctic and they gave up, said, okay, we're walking away from this, you know. We'll see what happens now. Donald Trump has reopened the Arctic to drilling. I don't know whether anyone's going to go up there or not, and we're going to fight them if they try. I show you all these pictures just to say, and here I really will end, that not to say we're going to win this fight. We don't know if we're going to win this fight. That's what makes it different from the other fights that humans have engaged in. The difference is it comes with a time limit. Dr. King always used to say at the end of talks, he would say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. This may take a while, but we're going to win. Okay? The arc of the physical universe appears to be short and to bend toward heat. And if we do not win soon, then we do not win. And that's what makes it different. So I don't know. I don't know how it works out. But I do know that there is, sort of against all odds now, a serious fight underway. And it is a fight that takes in every different kind of person on the planet. It's a fight that's increasingly led and needs to be led in a lot of ways by people who represent those frontline communities that are most vulnerable and most engaged, and they are stepping up and providing that leadership, and they need the rest of us to follow them as hard and close as we can, you know, to be there all the time in this fight. I remember when we had those 400,000 people in the streets of Washington, my job for the morning was to basically explain to all the senators and people who were coming why they weren't getting to be in the lead of the parade as it went down 6th Avenue, because we wanted indigenous groups and young people be the first, 40 blocks worth of things. And it took a little persuade senators like, well, yeah, don't worry, the cameras will find you, we will make sure, and you come walk back here and thank you for being here. Well, it was a beautiful day and a powerful day, and there have been many like it, and there need to be many more. We're in a bad period right now because of Donald Trump, and we can despair about it, and it probably won't do much good to despair about it. Probably do more good to figure out, at least for the moment, how local and state level we manage to do this stuff fast where we can. And if we do, that kind of modeling will help people in lots of other places too. I don't know how it comes out. I do know that it feels good to be part of a big, broad, diverse fight. And I thank you all of you so much for all that you've done to be part of it all along. Thank you all very much. Sit down. I think we got a microphone. Thank you all. It's fine to leave. We've got a few minutes for questions. Yeah, I've talked on for a long time. I got going, got wound up. Questions or comments or abuse of any kind or whatever is welcome. I see one over here. There we go.
Someone whose family came from Oklahoma, I'm inheriting mineral rights that oil companies are using for fracking, and I will be inheriting stock in Exxon, and I don't know what the best thing to do about that is. Do you have recommendations?
So there are two different questions. The Exxon stock you should sell, you should divest, and do whatever seems best with the money. The mineral rights, and I mean that's a hard question. I mean I think at this point I'm afraid that the right answer probably is to lock them up, and we need people extinguishing those rights in all the ways that we can, because we just can't afford to pull that stuff up out of the ground. There may be some ways. I mean, in an ideal world, we'd set up a system that would pay you for them and extinguish them, but I don't think that's going to happen in Oklahoma anytime soon, is my guess. And so we need those who can to keep in the ground what they can keep in the ground. It's one of the. It's funny. I was talking about this with on the CBC the other day, because the Canadians some of the Canadians are upset that they're not going to be able to fully develop their huge tar sands complex in Alberta, because it's makes some money. And I was like, look. You remember in the 1980s when we figured out that rainforests were so important to the planet, and we basically just tasked Brazil with protecting the rainforest, okay? And they actually did a way better job than people thought they were going to. It's not perfect, and at the moment it's kind of unraveling because Brazil's politics have become crazy too, but they've done a pretty darn good job. Well, those places around the world that have oil and gas and coal underground, they're in exactly the same situation. I mean, just as we have an operating planet, we pretty much have to have the Amazon standing. We pretty much have to keep all that stuff underground, And the only difference is, like, Brazil was poor. Canada's rich. I mean, Oklahoma and Texas would be rich places. We should be able to do all this, and our unwillingness to, as a country, is really sad. You could do that too. That might make good sense. Or someone like the Sierra Club or the local Nature Conservancy might have a good idea. I'd get in touch with the Nature Conservancy just for some planning about how to. There's got to be some tax things that you can. The Nature Conservancy is kind of the real estate agency for the environmental movement, so they're worth talking to.
Yeah. First, I found your talk very moving. I appreciate it.
So you're gonna rate it a 5.
I probably will rate it very high.
That's good. That's good. Just want to make sure.
So just toward the end here, I looked around the room, and I see a lot of people who I see often when I come to talks like this, and we're older. And I do see young people here, but not a lot. A little bit. I heard what you said early on about young people. I know that they're working hard, so this is no slam on you, but I'm wondering what recommendations you might have, considering what the audience looks like, and we'll still be around for another 10, 15 years, 20 years maybe, but yeah, so that's my concern.
That's a good question. I don't worry too much about young people because I know that they're in the lead in this fight everywhere. It's sometimes harder to coerce them to come sit inside halls listening to dull speeches in the middle of the day. They have classes, and hopefully they have all kinds of fun things to be doing in the world. But when it comes to it, they're there. They're the people who are doing it. It's good to see older people here. Statistically, older white people are the problem in America. That's where the vote bank for the people who do every bad thing in this country comes from. So part of our job is to be, as we Methodists say, it's a good mission field is one's own demographic. It's wonderful though to see how to see when people stand up. When I wrote out the letter asking people to come get arrested in Washington at the start of that Keystone fight, And remember, there'd never been any civil disobedience about environmental stuff really for a very long time in this country, and not about much anything else either till then, since the civil rights movement. One of the things I said in the letter was, young people do most of the work here, but they shouldn't be the cannon fodder here. Because if you're 19 or 22 or something, getting arrested, not a particularly maybe the best thing on your resume. One of the good things about growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you? You know, and so there's a kind of real liberation that comes in that way. Now we didn't, when people showed up to get arrested, we did not say, how old are you? Because that would be rude. But we did say, I thought cleverly, we said, who was president when you were born? Okay. And the two biggest cohorts came from the FDR and the Truman administrations. There was a guy arrested on the last day of this. He had a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care. He'd been born in the Warren Harding administration, which was so long ago, I'd forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration. You know, and what was really good about it was all the young people there got to see their elders acting the way that elders need to act in a working society. That's why it's so good to see you all here. So I think I don't actually worry about young people, and I don't worry about old people. There's a 40-year gap in the middle where it's difficult to get people engaged as they should be, you know. So that's sometimes what I worry about more.
So a lot of the conversation around sustainability happens to be focusing on personal decisions. So eat less meat, turn the lights off. But it seems like a lot more of the responsibility and a lot more of the impact comes from institutions, corporations, governments, universities. How do we change the conversation and the, that what we talk about to put the responsibility back onto them and put the change in those?
What I spend a lot of time doing now. The environmental movement wasted an immense amount of time hectoring people about their light bulbs and so on. And all of that's important, but all of it's obvious too. Like if you haven't figured out by now to put in the LED light bulb, then you're never going to figure it out. You know, until we change the rules so that that's the only kind of light bulbs there are, or so that there's a price on carbon, so it becomes obvious that you need to do this, or all the other things that require exactly the kind of institutional, political. So when people ask me, you know, you go on TV and I'll say, what are the 3 things that people should do in order to, and I know what they want me to talk about, you know, Priuses and so on. I was like, 1, you should organize. 2, you should get together with your neighbors and organize something so that, you know, you can put some pressure on politicians. 3, you really got to get with your community and organize things. And if you have some time left over after that and some energy, then by all means go, you know, explore the wonderful world of electric vehicles, or, you know, develop a remarkable vegan cuisine, or whatever it is. Those are all good, useful, important things. But we're way past the point where we can do this one person at a time. If we had 75 years, it'd be a great way to do it. But we don't, and so just brute reality means that's the direction we need to go. Somebody's, yeah, okay, good. You can.
Yeah, I'm part of a group that's making a children's piece called Pester Power, harnessing the pester power of children to try to get the adults to do the right thing on climate, racial climate, and physical climate. And I just heard from one person who's part of that group, Stacy, who happens to be sitting here, that in our county, there are people who are opposing solar power. And somehow there's some kind of organizing of a not in my backyard. So I was wondering if you have any suggestions for how to oppose this kind of...
Yeah, you know, so you've got to, there are people around the country who are managing to do it. Sometimes they're organized by the utilities and things, but sometimes they're just people who say, I don't want to look at. And you've got to be able to, people have got to stand up and say, you know what, that's not okay now. It's a winnable fight because most Americans are really excited about solar energy. It polls extremely well among Republicans, independents, and Democrats. It's the one thing that everyone kind of agrees would be a good idea. But there are people, oh, this will affect my property values, or I don't want to look at it, or whatever. It's like, come on. I mean, there are huge swaths of the earth that are turning into desert, melting. You can deal with this. You've got to have a slightly different aesthetic about what looks good. And if that's the change that you need to make in order to deal with, this enormous problem, we know you can do it. Stick with it. Somebody has been handing out microphones. There we go. Okay.
I have one. Hi, thank you. I wanted to put a short plug. If you were inspired by Mr. McKibben, please come to Students for Environmental Concerns. We organize every Wednesday at the YMCA. But one thing that I've felt from this speech was that you were giving us a lot of hope for the movement. And I think that's a really important tone to have. I'd like you to, give your opinions on what tones the environmental movement should take on. And it's been sort of a gloom and doom for a long time, but I don't think that really works.
It's a good question. I mean, I'm a writer and a journalist, so my basic take is you got to be honest all the time. You have to tell the truth, and that's the most effective thing to do. And it's also what people are owed, I mean, if we're going to take the planet over the cliff, we might as well do it with our eyes open and understand that it's what we're doing. We're, consciousness is theoretically our, we're Homo sapiens. This is our special thing. To do it obliviously would be the worst thing of all, But I think that there's plenty of room for hope now, especially around these questions around renewable energy. And so I think that there's plenty of reason to try and get people excited about what the future might look like down the road. We can see what that vision looks like now. And it's a nice one, I can't tell you how moved and excited I was to be in Africa last year and just see what was possible. And for affordable and doable. That's the thing. We could actually do all this stuff. We're completely capable of it. Humans are, when they set their mind to it, good at accomplishing remarkable things in short periods of time. We just have to get the fossil fuel industry out of the way and build the political will to get it done. And those are hard things to do, but they're possible, and they're why we build movements and try to build them in the kind of creative and hopeful ways that we do. So thank you for your work, and remind people it's Wednesdays. What time do you gather?
6:30 p.m. at the YMCA.
6:30 at the Y. Excellent. Do we have time for one or two more? I know we have to get to. We don't.
Can you say something about the necessity of offense being accepted? I think that's really important.
Sure. I will say that we had good news last week, again out of Massachusetts, where a number of my friends who had sat down in front of a proposed natural gas pipeline, including Karenna Gore, Al Gore's daughter, went to trial, and the judge, they said, we clearly did this thing because there are pictures of us doing it, and that was the point, but we did it because it was necessary to do it. And this never works to say this, but in this case, the judge listened to them and their expert witnesses and stuff and said, you know what, I think it was necessary. You're free to go now. And that was a good start, and there's going to be more action like that. We learned yesterday that the Children's Trust climate case that 24 young people have filed to demand that the federal government protect the atmosphere of the future is got a court date yesterday in federal court, October 24th of this fall. So that's a big deal. I don't know whether we'll win that case. I think the current Supreme Court is stacked against it if it gets there, but I also think that it's going to be one of the most valuable tools we have for just helping people understand. And you never know. I mean, we're due a few breaks in this fight, and if we keep it up in the right spirit, we will get them. So I think. Thank you all enormously.